Hello, America. We are back at Radio Free Market. David, so I just asked you to define a bailout, and you defined it as basically the government, because they have a sense that the economy is in danger, that they're going to take money from the tax base, from everyone who pays taxes, and give it to a company that has failed. That's why it's called a bailout. So now that we've defined what a bailout actually is, because I don't think a lot of people know that the bailout money, they don't get it from some vault. They just tax us and then they take it, or sometimes they do it through inflation, just by money printing. So could you briefly comment on this idea of equality under the law and ethics, norms of fairness in the context of the recent multi-trillion-dollar bailouts of the banks and General Motors, among other companies?
Yes, well, I think we can see very clearly that this bailout violates the notion of equality under the laws, because let's imagine, say you have a business, say you have a small restaurant, and it isn't doing very well, you're losing money on it. You can't go to the government and say, look, this is going to have a bad effect on my neighborhood. If my business fails, all my spending will go down, then this will have bad results for the people that I would have been spending money on. So you should give me money to help me out. We can't do this, but these banks that get the money will get enormous sums of money just because the government thinks there's going to be some big danger if they fail. Now, I think we can criticize this on two grounds. First, it hasn't been shown at all that if businesses fail, this is going to drag the whole economy down with them. We find businesses, even very large businesses, fail all the time, and what we need is, Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich Hayek point out, in a depression, Murray Rothbard was very much emphasizes, a depression represents the correction phase of the business cycle. In a boom, there's been malinvestment. There have been investments in projects that can't be supported, and these need to be liquidated. So the bailout actually interferes with economic recovery. And then the second point is, even if the government were correct that these businesses needed to be helped, that would still be a matter for the owners of the money to decide, not for Congress to decide. The government doesn't have the right to say, well, because we think that it's very important that a particular business not fail, therefore you can take your resources away from your money away from you to help that business. So basically, there are 2 points that the particular arguments they give are unsound, and they wouldn't have the right to do it anyway.
Mm-hmm. And I'm just going to play devil's advocate for a moment. Dr. Gordon, if the banks weren't bailed out, there would have been chaos. Hundreds of thousands of Americans would have lost their deposits. Thousands of workers would have been unemployed from General Motors. And as Tom Woods says, the earth would have broken free from its axis and gone spinning towards the sun. Would it have been more ethical to simply let these big companies fail, even if it would have meant terrible economic instability?
Well, you see, that's assuming that there would be such instability. But, to say that is to fall into this, what Frederick Bastiat, the great 19th century French economist, called the broken window fallacy, is, say, if you take money away from certain people to help these businesses, that'll certainly help those businesses. The banks then won't fail. But then these other people, the ones you've taken the money away from, then don't have the money to spend they otherwise would have. So it's true that if a business fails, various people will be out of work, will have to adjust, but the way to solve that, the best way to handle that, is simply to allow the market to work so that people will be able to adjust as fast as possible. If you take away money from people, then you're just interfering with the adjustment process. So you're hurting those you take the money away from. What about them? Why should we just consider the ones who were helped and say, look, these people would be have various bad effects if they're not helped? What about the ones you take it away from?
Mm-hmm. And to that point, the more I look at the ethical issues, the philosophical issues, the moral issues, I find out more and more that economics plays a huge part in all of them. And I think most people would agree that using violence against people you don't like is incompatible with freedom and the rule of law. But the public education system, and I think the media would have us believe that, for example, taxes on goods imported from China, that is good for America, or that the great men who run the government should be allowed to, in my home state, in California, for instance, the government should be allowed to hire men with machine guns to invade marijuana shops for the common good. So how are these examples indicative of how far America has strayed from the ideal of freedom under the law?
Oh, yeah. Well, in the examples you mentioned, these are interfering with voluntary transactions among people who aren't violating the rights of others. So to take your first example, suppose somebody wants to purchase something from China because he thinks that he can get the product is either better than what he can get in the U.S. or he can buy the similar product for less money. Why should the fact, if it is one that an American business would be better off if the person bought from that business, why should that justify the government stopping the consumer from buying from China? I think there's a tendency, and this I see in a lot of criticisms of free trade, that people will say, well, what's good for the economy, as if the economy were some separate individual. And we say, well, this will hurt the American national economy, and what we have to do rather is consider just the particular individuals involved. There's no separate economy apart from the individuals who are involved in particular transactions. So what we have in the case of tariffs or other interferences with trade is interfering with freedom of individuals in order to benefit other persons. So this is certainly a violation of equality under the law, rule of law. It's saying that particular people can be harmed in order to benefit other particular people, which is the exact contrary of what Hayek had in mind by the rule of law, where you have general regulation. Similarly, in your second example with the invading of marijuana growers, if people choose to use that drug, why does anyone else have the right to stop them just because they think it's wrong or they think that people shouldn't use it? It's up to them. They're not, the users of that aren't violating anyone else's rights. They're not compelling other people to use that drug. They just want to engage in a peaceful form of activity.
Mm-hmm. I've had some interesting conversations with some of my libertarian friends lately, just about kind of how an odd phenomenon it is that the left gets this reputation for being kind of hippie, groovy, the out there wild ones, when really it's libertarians that are kind of the most live and let live, hippie, groovy. We don't really care. I can't speak for the whole group. I don't really care as a libertarian. I don't really care if you want to go and sniff glue all day. I mean, it's really not up to me as long as you're not harming me or my property. So I just thought it's an interesting phenomenon that the left kind of gets this reputation for being the kind of hippie, groovy, live and let live ones. But anyway, that's beside the point. For our listeners, you can bring that up with a leftist friend, that we're really the hippie, groovy ones. So David, I've had some conversations recently about just how odd it is that the freedom under the law that we're talking about, and I think this is the most important question out of the whole interview, the freedom under law that we're talking about right now, we really learned it when we were in kindergarten. I mean, when we were kids, what are we taught? Aggressive violence is wrong and bad. Taking other people's things without their permission is not acceptable behavior. We learn that telling the truth is moral and it's good, and that everyone should be treated the same. No one should be getting preferential treatment. But when we grow up, we become accustomed to seeing adults, and even our own government, who I think most people agree is supposed to be kind of the fairest institution in the land. We see adults and the government killing people, lying their faces off, stealing other people's things, even in times of great hardship, and allowing certain types of people to get away with things that most cannot, a la, bailouts and things like that. So can you comment on this phenomenon? I just want to get your opinion.
Oh, yes. Well, I think you raise a point here that was actually very important when I was becoming acquainted with libertarian and classical liberal ideas back in my junior high days. I read the great pamphlet I want to recommend to all the listeners by Frederick Bastiat, that I mentioned before, called The Law. And the fundamental point he makes there is very similar to what you were mentioning in your comment, that people have the idea, what he considered the wrong idea, that the government has certain rights or follow certain moral rules that are different, should follow certain moral rules that are different from the rights of individuals. And he said, no, this isn't true. Just by getting together in a group, you don't acquire new moral. So it's the same morality that applies to individuals in the government. So if, just as we say it's wrong for individuals to steal or to use force on others who haven't used force on them first, it's wrong for the government to do so also. So the fundamental point is the government doesn't acquire rights that individuals don't have. And if we realize this very simple point, I think we'd be a lot better off. And it would require getting rid of nearly everything the government does.
That sounds good to me.
Yes, exactly.
Funny. So the next question I wanted to ask you is, I think every person would agree, just like to your point that you just said, no man has, or group of men has the right to exercise authority over another man. That's just not right. Many hundreds of years ago, some kings claimed divine right, that they were chosen by God to be kings, and now we know that is just illegitimate. Emperors in Asia, they claimed the mandate of heaven, that again they were chosen by God. And I think the world is more civilized now, and these ideas are correctly seen as illegitimate and wrong. So since no man or group of men has the right to rule over another man or group of men, and since this is actually the very nature of modern-day government, in that sense, is coercive government illegitimate?
Yes, I think it is. If you carry the idea out to its full logical point, then I think one would be inclined to agree with Murray Rothbard, who was my great friend for many years, the person I've learned the most about on political and economic matters from anyone else, that he thought what we take to be even the legitimate functions of government, like defense and justice, could be handled by private market agencies such as insurance companies or protection agencies. So he thought, why do we have to have a coercive government at all? Why shouldn't people make the arrangements for defense and justice that they voluntarily want to? Why do we have to have it forced on them if they don't want these?
Mm-hmm. And is it possible to have a peaceful society that operates within the rule of law, but also with a maximum amount of freedom for the individual without any person or group being given the monopoly of aggressive violence? And what principles must be widely shared to achieve that?
Well, I think it is possible because we see the market working very well, much better than government-controlled economy. So why would these other defense or justice be anything different? And the whole thing fundamentally depends, I think, on people coming to accept that only peaceful measures of resolution are acceptable, that we can't violate other people's rights, even if doing so is in pursuit of certain goals that we think are important. Say people realize, well, we can't take other people's property just because we think we want to help out certain firms or industries, then I think we'd have a chance of establishing a libertarian society. I think we'd be a lot better off, and we'd also be acting in accord with ethical requirements.
Mm-hmm. I was watching a Ron Paul video on YouTube the other day, and about a minute ago you said something, and I forgot to comment on it, but I'm coming back to it now. It was something about this idea that the government kind of takes upon itself to legislate morality, and that was kind of the first time I really thought critically about that, was when Ron Paul brought this up in a speech he gave, that you can't legislate morality. There would be no. It would be completely arbitrary, because again, it would be a completely democratic mob rule decision where whoever the temporary majority is at the time would come in and give their morality, and they would write that law, and then the next regime would come in and give legislate their particular brand of morality. So could you comment on that? How it's impossible to legislate morality and have a free society?
Oh yes. Well, there are 2 points there. One that I think brought out in what you said, Ron Paul said, morality is not something that is dependent on majority rule. There's say if we think that people have certain property rights, that isn't something that's subject to legislation. So the fact that if you have people trying to legislate morality, would just be they would be legislating their particular views on what people should do, and there would be no reason to think that these would be in accord with what is the correct morality. Then you might object to that. Well, what if they happen to pick out what turns out to be the correct moral views? Why couldn't they legislate then? Then the point there would be, in order to act...
David, we're coming close to the end of this segment. I'm so sorry to cut you off. That's such a good point. But we will come back to that at the end of this break. We are on Radio Free Market with Dr. David Gordon. Please stay with us. Hello, America, and welcome back to Radio Free Market. And David, you were discussing a point before I cut you off. I'll let you go at it.
Oh, well, the point was this, and I think it's a fundamental one, is if we're supposed to be acting morally, this is what we're doing there is we have to be acting freely. I mean, if someone, suppose you think that, it's morally wrong to use heroin. So if somebody's standing over you and said, well, I'm going to shoot you if you use heroin, then if you decide not to use it, you're not really acting morally. You're just saying, well, I'm going to bow to this person's superior force. So in order to act morally, we have to be free to act. And if the government legislates morality, this is really contradictory, because it's trying to get us to act morally in a way that can't achieve that end, since it's forcing us to be moral, so it's taking away our freedom.
That's a very interesting point. David, in my kind of learning process, one of the hardest things for me to kind of internalize or even to investigate, and I think for many people this is true, was to imagine freedom under the law without a coercive government because of two things. These are the biggies. Courts. How can you have courts and dispute resolution without government? And security, defense. How can is it possible to have courts and security organized on the free market without the heavy hand of government?
Oh, well, I think the thing to realize, there was a medieval maxim that used by medieval logicians that what is actual is possible. If something is actually taking place, then it's it's possible to have that. And we have had all sorts of private courts. In fact, courts developed really as agencies to settle disputes, and Bruno Leone has a very good book called Freedom and the Law, where he discusses how law can arise without legislation, just by having courts decide things, and then this becomes precedents get established, and we can build up a body of law without having it formally legislated. This was true both of English common law and Roman law, which Roman law developed in large part through private opinions by people who were recognized as authorities. They would simply write out their opinions, and then these would become accepted by other Roman lawyers.
Huh. I did not know that. So, and you gave one book. What, for our listeners, what is a good book or two on this subject of private courts and private security defense?
Well, one I like very much was by the person I mentioned who influenced me more than anyone else, Murray Rothbard. This is called Power and Market. It's really the second part of Man, Economy, and State. You can get this gigantic volume from the Mises Institute. If you don't want to buy it, you can actually get it online, called Man, Economy, and State with Power and Market. So if you look at the Power and Market, you can see this in operation. And I think Bruce Benson has a book on this subject. I have to, something like on private sort of decision making without the government. I'd have to look up the exact title of that, but if you just go to Bruce Benson, you can get that. That's one of the best books on that subject.
Okay. And we have about 1 minute left, and I just wanted to, in this last minute, Michael sent me an email informing me of your upcoming class on the epistemology of Ludwig von Mises. When does this course begin, and what's your goal, just very briefly?
Well, the course begins April 7th. It's 5 lectures. And what I had in mind is many people, when they read Mises, particularly Human Action, they'll be stumped by about the first 100 pages because they find it very difficult. They wonder, what is all this philosophical stuff? What I'm going to try to do is explain in easy-to-understand language.
David, I'm sorry to cut you off. I made this last segment too short, but if you want to check out David's course, it is on mises.org. Thank you to David Gordon for being with us today. This is Aaron Brown of Radio Free Market. Please visit us on the web at radiofreemarket.com. And wherever you are, please stand up for freedom. Thank you for listening.